I remember the way the scent of roses hit my nose the moment I entered the wedding hall. It was sweet at first, but something about it felt off, almost sickly. My heart pounded harder with each step I took through the lavish decorations, past the cheerful guests, and toward the front rows. I was searching for my friend, the bride, who had asked me to come at the last minute. She said she needed me. She sounded tense, and I could hear the tremble in her voice even through the phone. But she never explained why. She only said she had a feeling this day would not go as planned, and she trusted me more than anyone to help if something went wrong. I tried to shake off my own worries, but I couldn't. An unsettling feeling rose within me. It was as if a storm cloud had settled over my heart, promising thunder and lightning at any moment. The ceremony was about to begin, yet I found myself walking down the aisle of chairs, trying to find a seat. My mind was tangled with questions. What was so urgent that my friend had practically begged me to come? The bride, whom I'll call Julia, had been my best friend since medical school. She did not become a doctor like I did. Instead, she decided to leave after our second year, choosing to follow her passion for teaching children with special needs. But our bond stayed strong. We remained close, and when she met someone she wanted to marry, I was the first person she told. She always said, "You are my rock. I know you will always be there when I need you." And here I was, at her wedding, feeling as if I was about to walk into something I wasn't prepared for. Everything in the hall looked normal at first. The decorations were pretty, though not too fancy. Pale pink tablecloths covered the tables, and white balloons floated near the windows. Soft music played from hidden speakers, gentle enough to calm anyone's nerves under normal circumstances. But I wasn't calm. I was on edge. The call from Julia was still fresh in my mind, and the sense of urgency in her voice had not left my ears. Suddenly, the music shifted to the bridal march. I turned and saw Julia at the end of the aisle. She looked lovely. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant, with a lace bodice and a satin skirt that brushed the floor. Her face was serene, but I caught a flicker of worry in her eyes. Then I realized she was not looking at the crowd or her parents or even the altar. She was looking directly at me. A half plea, half question was written on her face. I glanced toward the groom. His name was Victor, and I had met him a few times before. He always seemed polite and well-mannered, though a bit reserved. He was standing near the altar, looking at Julia, smiling. But something was off. Maybe it was the way the overhead lights shone on him that made him look paler than usual. Or perhaps it was the slight sway I thought I saw in his stance. One moment, he seemed stable. Then, in the corner of my eye, I noticed his posture falter before he caught himself. It was the smallest movement, but it set off warning bells in my mind. As a doctor, I've been trained to notice even the faintest sign that someone might be in distress. Julia made her way down the aisle, each step determined but slow. Then her father handed her over to Victor, and the ceremony started. The officiant began to speak about love, commitment, and the promise of a future together. It was lovely, and I wished I could enjoy the moment. But I was too busy watching Victor. His face had grown paler, and his right hand trembled ever so slightly as he held Julia's. Julia looked worried now too. Her eyes darted between Victor and me. She must have seen me watching him, trying to figure out what was wrong. But I was not sure yet. I only knew something was out of place. At last, they finished the vows, and the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Everyone stood to clap and cheer. Victor leaned over to kiss Julia, and a round of applause burst through the hall. But in that moment, I caught a glimpse of sweat on his brow, and his lips looked strangely blue-tinged. I told myself I might be imagining it. Perhaps the lighting was playing tricks on my eyes. But deep inside, my medical instincts roared that something was not normal. The ceremony ended, and we all moved on to the reception area. Large tables were set with plates of food, stuffed chicken, fresh salads, small bowls of soup, and slices of bread arranged in neat baskets. Glasses of juice and champagne were being passed around by servers, who wore matching black uniforms. Everyone was smiling and congratulating the newlyweds, hugging them and giving toasts. The music was livelier now, and some guests started dancing. I stood near one of the tables, watching it all. Julia shot me looks every few minutes. It felt like she was urging me to do something, though I did not know what. Then, at last, I saw my chance. The crowd thinned around the newlyweds, and I slipped closer. Victor stood next to Julia, greeting a small group of relatives. I noticed that he was wearing a blazer, dark gray, and it looked a little large for him. The sleeves extended slightly past his wrists, which was odd because Victor was a well-fitted kind of guy. He seemed the type who would get his clothing tailored. Why would he wear a blazer that was too big? I tried to shake it off. Maybe he had lost weight. People do that before weddings. But that thought led me to a more concerning question. Had he been sick? A part of me felt guilty for suspecting anything was seriously wrong, but I could not help it. The sweat on his brow, the slight trembling of his hand, the way he occasionally rubbed his chest as if he had some discomfort. These were not the signs of a healthy groom on his wedding day. At last, Julia saw me approaching and squeezed Victor's hand. He turned his eyes on me. I forced my best smile and said, "Congratulations, you two." Julia nodded, but she looked tense. "I'm so glad you made it," she said, her voice quiet. "Thank you for coming." Victor also smiled, though his face looked strained. "Thank you for being here," he said politely. But as he spoke, I heard a roughness in his voice. It was as though he was holding back a cough or was in some discomfort. The guests around us were still busy mingling or dancing. Soft music played in the background, and the servers passed around fresh glasses of champagne. I bent closer to Julia and whispered, "Is everything okay?" She hesitated, then pulled me aside. Victor stayed where he was, greeting his relatives. "I need you to check him," she said in a low tone. "I've never seen him like this. He keeps saying he's fine, but I don't believe it." I nodded. "I'll see what I can do." I returned to where Victor stood, waiting for a break in his conversations. He was talking with his aunt and uncle, who seemed busy telling him how proud they were. Eventually, they left to speak with other guests. He turned to me, eyebrows raised. "How are you enjoying the wedding?" he asked. I tried to be polite. "It's lovely. You both look wonderful. But Victor, do you feel all right?" He shifted his weight. His eyes flickered with something like apprehension, but he attempted a reassuring smile. "I'm fine," he insisted. "A bit tired from all the planning, but it's nothing serious." He gave me a nod, as if that alone would convince me, but I could not let it drop. "I'm a doctor," I said gently. "Julia is worried about you. I just want to make sure everything is okay. I noticed you seem a bit under the weather." Victor's expression tightened. I could see a million thoughts flash behind his eyes. Then he sighed, his shoulders dropping. "It's been a stressful week," he said. "I promise I'm all right." Something in his voice did not match his words. I glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Then I said, "Do you mind if I have a quick look? It doesn't have to be here in the crowd." He hesitated. I don't want to alarm Julia," he said. "This is her big day." "She's already alarmed," I said. "Let me help." He looked torn, but he gave in. Together we walked away from the center of the reception. We found a small corner near the side exit, where only a few boxes of extra decorations were stacked. The chatter and music faded as we stood there, facing each other. I could see fresh beads of sweat on his forehead, and the color in his cheeks was not good. The next moment, he gripped the wall, as if he needed support. "Are you dizzy?" I asked urgently, placing a hand on his arm. He nodded, his eyes half closed. "Just a little." "I'm okay," he insisted, though his voice quivered. I could hear the worry in my head growing louder. "Victor, let me take a look. Do you have any medical conditions I should know about?" His eyes flickered, and I sensed he might be hiding something. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and checked it, then stuffed it back in, glancing at me. "Sorry," he muttered. "I've been getting messages all day." I was about to press further when Julia appeared. She must have been watching us and seen us slip out. Her lips trembled in fear, and she grabbed Victor's hand. "Tell him," she urged. "He's not just a friend. He's a doctor. Please let him help." Victor looked at her, then at me. His eyes shone with an emotion I could not place, part guilt, part fear. Slowly, he reached to unbutton his blazer. I froze. Was he about to show me a bandage? A strange device? A wound? My thoughts raced. And as he pulled aside one edge of the blazer, I saw something that made my heart clench. Underneath his shirt was the outline of a small medical port on his chest, a port commonly used to deliver medication or to draw blood in patients who undergo long-term treatment, like chemotherapy or other therapies. I had seen those ports many times in my practice. This meant Victor had a serious condition, something he had not told Julia about, or maybe something they had been trying to manage quietly. Julia's eyes were wet. She placed a trembling hand on Victor's shoulder. "He has a heart condition," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "He told me it was mild, that the doctors just wanted to monitor him, but he never told me about this port." I inspected it gently. I didn't want to cause him any discomfort. I noticed a slight bulge that looked like a small device next to the port. It might have been a monitor or some other support. Victor's breathing was shallow as he let me look. "What are they treating you for?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. He swallowed hard. "I have a heart defect," he admitted. "I've had it since birth. It was small, something they thought wouldn't cause big problems. But it got worse a few months ago. They said I needed regular medication delivered directly into my bloodstream. That's why I have the port. I didn't want anyone to worry, especially Julia. I wanted this day to be perfect." Julia let out a soft sob. "You should have told me," she whispered. "I would have stayed by your side. I just can't believe you kept this from me." Victor's eyes brimmed with tears, but he did his best to keep his composure. "I was scared," he said, voice trembling. "I thought if you knew how serious it was, you might not want. I didn't want you to feel burdened by my condition." Julia shook her head. "You're not a burden. I love you." My heart ached at the sincerity in her voice. But I could not ignore Victor's condition. "Victor," I said gently, "how are you feeling right now? You look exhausted and short of breath." He managed a weak nod. "I'm tired, and I keep feeling my heart race. The doctors said it might happen if I was under stress." "And a wedding is definitely stressful," I said. "We need to check your vital signs. Do you have any medication with you?" He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out a small vial of pills. "This is my rescue medication," he explained. "If I feel my heart is going out of rhythm." "Have you taken any?" He shook his head. "Not yet. I didn't want to cause a scene. I thought I could push through." Julia's hands were shaking as she looked at him. "I would rather have a scene than risk losing you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I nodded. "Victor, take your medication. Right now. We can worry about the rest later. Your health is the top priority." He nodded, swallowing hard, and then took his pill with a glass of water Julia rushed to get from a nearby table. After a few moments, some color returned to his face, though he still looked worn out. I felt torn between telling him he needed to go to the hospital and wanting to keep the peace for their wedding day. Still, health had to come first. "I think we should get you checked out," I said. "I can drive you to the hospital. We can do a quick exam just to be sure. Once I'm sure you're stable, maybe we can come back." Julia's eyes were full of tears again. "Let's go," she said immediately. "The wedding can wait." Victor opened his mouth to protest, but Julia took his hand. "We're a team now," she said. "You are my husband. I'm your wife. We face things together." A strong wave of relief passed through me. There was so much love in Julia's words that it almost brought tears to my own eyes. Victor's eyes were also brimming with tears. He leaned his forehead against hers and whispered, "I'm sorry. I never wanted to scare you." She pressed a kiss to his cheek. "We'll get through this." We snuck out the side door, quietly. Julia quickly told her parents that Victor needed some fresh air and that we might return later. They looked confused, but they did not stop us. We made our way to my car, helped Victor into the passenger seat, and set off toward the local hospital. The drive was tense, though we tried to keep Victor calm. Julia held his hand the whole time, whispering that everything would be all right. At the hospital, I used my credentials to get him examined quickly. An ECG was done, and the nurse took blood samples. The on-call cardiologist recognized me. We had been in medical school together. He explained that Victor's heart condition had become more delicate than expected, and stress or strong emotions could cause palpitations or arrhythmias. He agreed that Victor should have let someone know, so we could have taken precautions during the wedding. Julia sat by Victor's side, her wedding gown bunched up around her on the small hospital chair. She kept rubbing his hand, tracing small circles along the back of it. Victor stared at her like she was the only thing that mattered in the world. A bit later, the doctor returned with some good news. The medication had stabilized Victor's heart rhythm, and as long as he avoided heavy stress for the rest of the day, he would be all right. Victor looked tired, but relieved. Julia let out a shaky sigh and gave him a teary smile. I could feel the tension in my chest finally loosen. All evening, I'd had this sense of impending doom. Now, it felt as if the clouds had begun to part. The doctor recommended at least a few hours of rest, just to be sure everything was stable. Victor stayed on a hospital bed, the machinery beeping softly next to him. Julia asked for some blankets, since the hospital gown left him cold. I stepped out to give them a moment alone, and also to call her parents, letting them know what happened. They were worried, of course, but grateful that everything seemed under control. Once the doctor said Victor was fine to leave, we slowly walked out of the hospital together. The sky was now filled with orange and pink streaks, the sun getting lower on the horizon. The day was slipping away, but Julia and Victor's wedding day was not ruined. Not really. In some ways, it felt more meaningful. They had faced a serious test together and come out stronger. Julia insisted that we return to the wedding hall if Victor was up to it. The rest of the reception was still going on, though guests were beginning to leave or had already left. Victor looked at her, then at me. "Are you sure we should go back?" he asked gently. "I don't want you to miss more of your wedding day because of me." Julia let out a small laugh, though her eyes shimmered with leftover tears. "You are the wedding," she said, hugging him. "I want to dance with you at least once tonight." I nodded, relieved. Then I pulled up a chair, and we shared a calm breakfast. The sun streamed through the large windows of the hotel restaurant, casting a golden glow over the table. I realized that sometimes the happiest endings come after the greatest challenges. Love does not always look like a big, fancy celebration without a single problem. Sometimes, love is rushing to a hospital in a wedding gown or dancing slowly, carefully, mindful of a fragile heart. After we finished, Julia leaned over and kissed Victor's cheek. Then she looked at me. "We're planning a small, relaxed get-together in a few weeks. We want to invite close friends and family. We'll celebrate properly then. Will you come?" I laughed gently. "Try to stop me," I said. "I'll be there." Victor took a slow breath, still being cautious, and smiled. "And I promise to take better care of myself," he said. "No more secrets." Julia gazed at him, and it was clear that no matter what their future held, they would face it side by side. She shook her head in a gentle but firm way. "No more secrets," she repeated, linking her fingers with his. "We share everything now." I could not resist smiling. There was a bright joy in the air, the kind that follows relief after a storm. The fear was gone, replaced by fresh hope. We clinked our coffee cups quietly in a mini-toast. I looked at these two dear people, holding hands, hearts joined in true love. And I realized that what had begun as a frightening day had ended more beautifully than any of us could have expected. He smiled, his eyes glistening. "All right," he said, "but let's promise to take it easy." We got back into my car, and I drove them to the hall. When we arrived, the lights were still on, though some staff members were cleaning up. A handful of guests lingered, chatting among themselves. When Julia's parents saw us walk in, they rushed over with relief and concern. At first, everyone was frightened that something terrible had happened, but we quickly explained that Victor was fine, just in need of rest. Julia led Victor to the dance floor. The music had been turned low, but one of the staff members kindly adjusted it, putting on a soft, slow song. With his hand trembling slightly in hers, Victor guided Julia around the floor in a gentle sway. No fancy spins or dramatic dips, just a quiet, intimate dance between two people who had just been through a scary ordeal. I watched from the sidelines, feeling both relieved and proud. Julia had always been strong of heart, and her love for Victor shone like a guiding light. The staff and a few remaining guests gathered around, offering applause and encouragement. It wasn't a grand wedding spectacle, but it was something even more precious. It was a real, honest moment of love and commitment, with all its vulnerabilities. When the dance ended, Victor pressed a tender kiss to Julia's forehead. Tears gathered in her eyes again, but she was smiling. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he answered softly. The remaining guests formed a small circle around them, cheering quietly. Julia's mother wiped away tears, and her father gently put an arm around her. I could see that despite the fear and worry, this wedding day would stay in their memories as a day of deep closeness. Sometimes, life tests us at our most meaningful moments, and maybe those challenges make the joy even stronger. We spent the next hour or so chatting and laughing softly as the adrenaline gradually left our systems. The staff kindly offered to keep the hall open a bit longer, allowing Julia and Victor to share a small slice of wedding cake. I noticed Victor took only a few bites before admitting he was too tired to stay, which was no surprise. The day had been more draining than most wedding days, both physically and emotionally. Julia decided that it was time to call it a night and head to their suite. "We'll have a proper celebration with everyone once Victor has fully recovered," she said. Her parents agreed. I volunteered to drive them to the hotel where they had booked their wedding night stay, though we made sure to have a plan if Victor felt unwell again. I promised to stay close by in a room down the hall, so I could check on him if he felt any discomfort or if Julia became worried. It was well past midnight when we arrived at the hotel. I helped Julia gather her dress in her arms so it wouldn't drag on the ground. Victor walked slowly, leaning a little on her for support, but insisting he could manage. The check-in was quick. The hotel staff had been informed earlier it was for a wedding night, so the suite was prepared with rose petals and a small bottle of champagne. Julia looked at Victor with tenderness in her eyes. He smiled back, though we all knew the champagne would have to wait. Rest was more important. Before I left them to themselves, Julia gave me a big hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." Victor offered his hand. "Thank you for saving me," he said, and I shook his hand, feeling the warmth of human connection that unites us in our most vulnerable moments. "You two get some rest," I said. "We'll deal with the rest of the world tomorrow." I went to my own room, physically and emotionally spent. I kicked off my shoes, loosened my tie, and sank onto the bed. My mind replayed the day's events, the wedding, the anxiety, the shocking discovery of Victor's hidden condition, and the trip to the hospital. But most of all, I kept seeing the moment Julia and Victor danced, quietly and lovingly, even after all the fear they had just faced. It was beautiful. I slept like a rock. When morning came, I woke to a text from Julia. "We're all right. Thank you so much. Doctor says Victor just needs rest and checkups. Come have breakfast with us, if you can." I smiled at my phone, a flood of relief coursing through me. Everything was going to be okay. These two had been thrown a curveball on what was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. Yet they had seen that night, through it together, united by love. To me, that was the definition of a true marriage. Standing by each other in sickness and in health, in joy and in fear, never letting go of each other's hands. I got dressed and headed down to the hotel dining area. There, I found them sitting at a small table, looking more like a married couple than ever. Julia had changed into a casual dress, her face free of the heavy makeup she wore the day before, and Victor wore a loose shirt, his blazer nowhere in sight. He still looked a bit pale, but there was a new warmth in his eyes. I approached and asked softly, "How are you feeling, Victor?" He smiled. "Much better, thanks to you both." Julia reached for his hand on the table. "He's already eaten some fruit and cereal. He's resting more, which is what the doctor advised." Their wedding day was not perfect in the usual sense, but it was real. Victor's hidden condition had come to light, and it was frightening for a while. But it also brought them closer, forced them to communicate, and showed Julia how strong her love was. In the end, it gave them a new start as husband and wife, facing life's ups and downs with honesty and courage. We walked out of the restaurant as the sun climbed higher, warm and bright. Outside, the day was full of promise. Birds twittered in the nearby trees, and people passed by, some in a hurry, some strolling leisurely. In that moment, time seemed to pause for the three of us. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and the sweet smell of fresh-cut grass mingled with the memory of last night's tension. Julia and Victor smiled at each other, then at me. "Thank you," they said again, almost in unison. I shook my head, touched by their gratitude. "It was the least I could do," I answered softly. "I'm just glad you're both all right." And so, in the hush of that peaceful morning, the wedding story ended not with a grand fireworks display, but with the quiet assurance that love had overcome fear. The bride and groom walked forward, hand in hand, ready to face whatever life had in store for them. I watched them go, feeling my own heart lighter than it had been in months. Though our beginning had been unsettling, and the day had been filled with uncertainty, the ending was one of hope, unity, and promise. In the weeks that followed, Victor kept up with his medical appointments, and Julia supported him every step of the way. I remained close, offering my medical expertise and my friendship. They held the small gathering they had promised, a warm, intimate celebration at a garden pavilion, under a clear sky. Family and close friends came to share in the joy they nearly missed. This time, there were no secrets, no fears overshadowing the day. Just smiles, heartfelt laughter, and an unbreakable bond. When I look back on that wedding, I do not recall a single flaw in the flowers, or whether the music was too loud, or if the cake was sliced perfectly. What stays with me is the image of Julia in her white dress, guiding Victor out of the wedding hall, determined to care for him when he was too proud to ask for help. It is the picture of them slow dancing in the nearly empty reception area, cherishing every second. That is real love, a love that steps up when things go wrong, a love that grows stronger in the face of trials. And that love stayed with them from that day on, blessing them with many years of shared joy, minor quarrels, reconciliations, and endless devotion. A love that started with promises at an altar, tested by a hidden fear, and ultimately saved by truth, courage, and compassion. Yes, it was an unsettling moment when I first walked into the wedding hall and realized that something was not right about the groom. But I would not trade that day for anything, because in its trials, I witnessed a love so real and pure that it inspires me still. It reminds me that even in the darkest moments, hope can find a way. And that is what a wedding, and perhaps life itself, is all about. Facing the shadows together and finding your way back to the light.